I woke up to the metallic taste first. It coated the back of my tongue like I'd bitten through a battery. Then came the ringing in my ears, sharp and high, as if someone had pressed a tuning fork against my skull. The ceiling above me warped at the edges. The shadows in the living room stretched too long. I knew that feeling. The aura. The warning. I reached for the small emergency nasal spray I always kept on the side table beside the couch. My fingers met nothing but wood. No. I pushed myself up, heart racing, vision splitting into fragments. The room tilted hard to the left. My body felt heavy and distant at the same time, like I was trying to control someone else's limbs from across a foggy lake. I scanned the table again. My pill bottle was there, my water glass, my phone. But the emergency spray was gone. The ringing grew louder. A wave of déjà vu hit me so violently it stole the air from my lungs. I tried to stand. My knees buckled. The seizure took me before I could reach for anything else. My muscles locked, then convulsed. My shoulder slammed against the hardwood floor. My jaw snapped shut. The world narrowed to flashes of white light and fractured sound. Somewhere far away, I heard footsteps. When awareness returned in pieces, my cheek was pressed against the floor. My body felt like it had been wrung out and dropped. My tongue throbbed. My ribs ached. Chloe was standing above me. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't calling for help. She was watching. Her face was blank, almost bored. She tilted her head slightly and said, flat and steady, "Stop faking." Then she stepped over my body and walked toward the kitchen. That was the moment I understood this was never an accident. 3 days earlier, I had convinced myself moving back home would be temporary, practical, harmless. My name is Abigail Turner. I was 33 years old then, an artificial intelligence engineer based in Boston. I built predictive models for a living. I trusted patterns. I trusted data. I trusted what could be measured. I did not trust chaos. After an electrical fire damaged my apartment, I had nowhere to go for a few weeks. Insurance covered repairs, but not immediacy. My parents' house in suburban Connecticut was an hour and a half away. Close enough. Familiar enough. Temporary, I told myself. I had post-traumatic epilepsy. A car accident 6 years earlier had left me with a seizure disorder that required strict nightly medication. One missed dose wasn't catastrophic. Several missed doses in a row could be. My old bedroom was no longer mine. Chloe had converted it into a streaming studio. Ring lights, pastel backdrop, camera mounts. I was assigned the living room couch. "It's just for a few weeks," my mother had said. "You're not exactly a guest." Chloe had smiled when she said it. "Don't forget your pills," she added lightly. "Wouldn't want a scene." At the time, I'd assumed it was a joke. The first 2 nights back, I felt off. Slight dizziness. A strange mental lag when I tried to read emails. My resting heart rate climbed higher than usual during sleep. I blamed stress. Disruption. The humiliation of being back under a roof I had fought to leave. I kept my pill bottle on the small table beside the couch. I was meticulous about it. Every night at 10, alarm, pill, water, logged in my medication tracker app. But by the 3rd night, something unsettled me. When I picked up the bottle, it felt lighter than it should have. I shook it gently. The rattle sounded thin. I told myself I was miscounting. I was tired. I was paranoid. I was not paranoid. The night of the seizure, I had taken my pill at 10, like always. Or at least I thought I had. My memory of that moment blurred when I tried to replay it later. Had the bottle been slightly angled differently? Had the cap been looser? After Chloe stepped over me and disappeared into the kitchen, I lay there on the floor and forced myself to breathe evenly. My body was still trembling in aftershocks. My head pounded. No one came running. No one asked if I needed an ambulance. Eventually, I pulled myself up and dragged my body back onto the couch. In the morning, my muscles were bruised and my jaw sore from clenching. I found Chloe at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. "You moved my emergency spray," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And my medication levels have been off for days." She looked up slowly, then laughed. "Abby, you had one episode. You're under a lot of pressure." "I didn't miss my doses." "Maybe you did," she replied. "You've been distracted." My mother joined us, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Sweetheart, maybe you should talk to someone," she said gently. "Stress can make you imagine patterns that aren't there." "Imagine." My father stood by the sink, staring at the faucet as if it required intense concentration. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I went back to the living room and opened my laptop. I logged into my health dashboard and pulled up the last week of data from my smartwatch and medication tracker. Heart rate variability, sleep cycles, neurological markers tied to seizure risk. There it was. 3 consecutive nights of declining stability metrics. Subtle, but measurable. A drop in the therapeutic consistency I'd maintained for years. I opened my refill history and cross-referenced it with the date I'd arrived at the house. The numbers did not align. I stared at the graph on my screen, the line dipping lower each night, like a quiet descent no one else would notice. I didn't believe in instincts. I believed in evidence. And the evidence was starting to say that someone in that house had been adjusting my life one pill at a time. I was still sore when I walked into the kitchen the next morning, every muscle in my body reminding me what had happened on that hardwood floor. Chloe was already there, leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone like nothing in the world had shifted. My mother stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal. My father sat at the table with the newspaper open, though I noticed he hadn't turned a page. "I had a seizure last night," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And my emergency spray was missing." Chloe looked up slowly, blinking as if I'd just asked her about the weather. "You had an episode," she corrected. "There's a difference." "There was no spray in the drawer," I said. "And my pill count doesn't match." She gave a soft laugh, the kind she used when one of her livestream followers said something ridiculous. "Abigail, you've been under insane stress. Your apartment burned out. You moved back here. You barely sleep. You're probably miscounting." My mother turned from the stove with a concerned expression that felt rehearsed. "Honey, you've always been so hard on yourself. Maybe you need to talk to someone, a therapist, just to process everything." "I don't need therapy," I said. "I need to know why my medication levels are off." My father's eyes flicked toward me for half a second before dropping back to the paper. Chloe tilted her head. "Maybe you shouldn't be managing your own meds right now." The words landed heavier than anything else she'd said. I felt the shift then. The conversation wasn't about the seizure. It was about me, my reliability, my competence, my sanity. I didn't argue again. I finished my coffee, went back to the living room, and opened my laptop. Data didn't roll its eyes. Data didn't smirk. I pulled up my health app and exported the last 2 weeks of metrics. Heart rate variability, sleep disruptions, neurological markers flagged by my wearable. I overlaid that with my medication tracker and created a quick timeline. Night 1 back in the house. Mild instability. I'd blamed the move. Night 2. Elevated resting heart rate. Night 3. Cognitive fog logged in my work notes. Night 5. Seizure. The pattern wasn't random. The decline was gradual, measured. I scheduled urgent blood work at a hospital 15 minutes away and didn't tell anyone where I was going. The nurse wrapped the cuff around my arm and asked routine questions. "Any recent changes in dosage?" "No," I said. That's the problem. When the results came back later that afternoon, the neurologist on call didn't soften it. Your levels are below therapeutic range, she said. Significantly. Could stress cause that? I asked. Stress doesn't metabolize medication out of your bloodstream, she replied carefully. Missed doses do. I thanked her, walked out to the parking lot, and sat in my car for a long minute with my hands on the steering wheel. Missed doses. I hadn't missed any. Back at the house, Chloe was upstairs streaming. I could hear her laughing through the ceiling. My mother was folding laundry. My father was in his study. I didn't confront them again. Instead, I went to the coffee table, picked up the pill bottle, and counted. I counted twice. Then, I took a photo of the bottle and logged the number in a spreadsheet. If someone was adjusting my medication, I would see the pattern. That night at dinner, my mother made a point of asking how my doctor visit went. I'm fine, I said. My levels were just low. Chloe stabbed at her salad. See, you probably forgot a dose. I didn't. She shrugged. You're human. I looked at my father. Dad, have you noticed anything strange lately? He hesitated. Strange how? With the trust documents. With anything. Chloe's fork paused mid-air. What does that have to do with anything? She asked lightly. I watched her carefully. You mentioned something the other night about not wanting a scene before Dad signs anything. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You're twisting things. I was joking. My mother's tone sharpened just slightly. Your father is updating the trust. That's normal estate planning. Don't create drama where there isn't any. There it was again. Drama, instability, overreaction. I excused myself and went back to the couch. I opened my email. Buried between work notifications was a message with no subject line. The sender's address was a random string of letters and numbers. The body of the email contained one sentence. Ask about the trust fund. I heard them say she only needs one episode. I read it 3 times. She only needs one episode. One seizure. My throat went dry. I stood and walked to the front window. Across the street, Leonard's porch light flickered on. He was watering his plants even though the sun had already dipped below the trees. He glanced up, and for a brief second, our eyes met. Then he looked away. I went back to the couch and pulled up the trust documents I still had access to from prior years. I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. There was a clause regarding temporary incapacity. If a beneficiary was deemed medically unstable or cognitively impaired, management authority could be reassigned. My name appeared in that clause. So did Chloe's. I leaned back slowly. If I appeared unreliable, if I collapsed in front of my father, if I seemed confused or erratic, it wouldn't just be a family embarrassment, it would be documentation. I opened my medication tracker again and zoomed in on the timestamps. The dips weren't chaotic. They were precise. 3 consecutive nights of reduced stability, then a seizure. 1 episode. My phone buzzed with a bank notification, a pending transfer from a shared investment account tied to the trust. Destination: Turner Media Solutions, Chloe's company. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady in a way it hadn't been all week. They weren't just trying to make me doubt myself. They were building a case. And for the first time since I hit that floor, I realized I wasn't the only one collecting evidence. I didn't sleep much that night. The sentence from the anonymous email replayed in my head over and over. She only needs 1 episode. 1 seizure. I opened my laptop before sunrise and built a timeline. I exported 2 weeks of medication logs, heart rate variability data, and sleep disruption reports. I laid them side by side in a spreadsheet and color-coded each anomaly. My mind slipped into familiar territory. Clean lines, logical flow, patterns emerging where chaos used to live. Night 1 back in the house. Slight instability. a drop small enough to ignore. Night 2, elevated pulse during sleep. Night 3, shortened REM cycle. Night 4, neurological irregularity flagged by my wearable. Night 5, seizure. The decline wasn't steep, it was controlled. If I had been truly careless with my medication, the graph would have shown spikes and gaps. Instead, it showed gradual erosion, a deliberate reduction. My stomach tightened. I scrolled further back, to my first night in the house. There was a subtle dip even then, a test. I pushed my chair back and stared at the living room ceiling. Someone had been adjusting my dosage carefully enough to avoid immediate detection. Someone who understood that abrupt withdrawal would raise alarms. Someone who knew how my body reacted. I remembered the small security camera I had installed in the garage 2 years ago after a package theft. It wasn't meant for this. It was angled toward the entryway between the garage and the house. I logged into the cloud archive. Footage from the first week loaded slowly, frame by frame. At 12:23 a.m. on my second night back, Chloe appeared at the edge of the frame. She moved quietly, barefoot, hair tied back. She paused at the threshold, listening. Then she stepped fully into view and walked toward the living room. The camera didn't capture the couch directly, but I could see her kneel near the coffee table. She stayed there for almost a full minute. Then she stood and walked back upstairs. I checked the timestamp. That was the night my metrics dipped for the first time. I fast-forwarded. Another clip. 1:27 a.m. Third night. Same movement, same deliberate pace. My pulse remained steady as I watched. It wasn't shock anymore. It was confirmation. In one clip, she froze halfway across the room and turned her head sharply toward the hallway, as if she sensed something. For a second, her face angled toward the camera's direction. Her expression wasn't angry or nervous. It was focused. I minimized the footage and opened my banking app. The pending transfer from the shared investment account was still under review. I tapped into transaction history and filtered by the last 30 days. 2 completed transfers stood out, both routed to Turner Media Solutions, both authorized digitally under my mother's co-signing credentials. The first transfer dated 3 days before my metrics began declining. The second dated 2 days before my seizure. My breath slowed. Financial pressure, medical instability, documentation of incapacity. I pulled up the trust documents again and searched for the clause regarding temporary incapacity. If a beneficiary demonstrated sustained cognitive impairment or medically verified instability, management authority could be reassigned pending review. Chloe's name appeared as a provisional co-manager in that scenario. I closed the laptop and stood. Across the street, Leonard's curtains were half drawn. I didn't text him. I didn't call. I walked. He opened the door before I knocked twice.
"You got my email,"
he said quietly.
"Yes."
He stepped aside and let me in. His living room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. A small monitor sat on a side table, connected to his porch security system. "I didn't know what to do," he said. "I wasn't sure if I was overreacting." "You weren't," I said. He hesitated, then pulled up footage from 2 nights before my seizure. The camera faced his front porch, but audio carried when voices were loud enough outside. The clip began with my mother's voice. "You're doing it too fast," she said. Chloe answered, lower, irritated. "It has to be gradual. She tracks everything." My throat went dry. "Just make sure it happens before your father signs." My mother continued. "We can't risk her questioning it." The video crackled slightly in the cold night air. Chloe's voice again.
"If she has an episode in front of him, that'll settle it."
My fingers dug into the armrest. Leonard stopped the clip.
"There's more,"
he said. He loaded another file. This one was recorded the night before my seizure. My mother's voice was sharper. Don't let her keep that emergency spray nearby. If she stops it too early, it won't look serious. Chloe replied, calm. I already moved it. Silence filled Leonard's living room. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. It was almost worse that I felt steady.
Will you provide this to an attorney? I asked.
Yes, he said without hesitation. I will. I thanked him and stepped back outside into the cold afternoon air. Halfway across the street, my phone buzzed. I glanced down. A new notification from my bank. Large withdrawal pending review. The amount was larger than the previous transfers. I tapped into the details. The request had been initiated less than an hour ago. From inside the house. I lifted my eyes slowly to the front door. Through the window, I could see Chloe's silhouette moving past the hallway. They weren't panicking. They were accelerating. I walked back inside quietly and went straight to the living room. My pill bottle sat exactly where I had left it. I picked it up. It felt lighter again. I counted. 2 pills missing since the night before. Not enough to trigger immediate collapse. Just enough to start the slope again. I opened my spreadsheet and logged the new count. Then I locked the bottle inside my laptop bag and zipped it shut. If they were running out of time before my father signed those documents, so was I. For the first time since I hit that floor, I wasn't trying to prove I wasn't unstable. I was building a case, and now I had more than suspicion. I had audio, I had video, I had financial motive. They thought one seizure would erase me. They didn't realize every move they made was being recorded. I called the attorney before I gave myself time to second-guess it. Sarah Whitman's office was in Hartford, all glass walls and muted gray furniture. She looked exactly like someone who did not tolerate drama. Sharp eyes, measured posture, a pen aligned perfectly with the edge of her legal pad. I placed everything on the table in front of her, my medication logs, blood test results, screenshots of my banking transfers, still images from the garage camera, the audio files Leonard had sent me that morning. She didn't interrupt while I spoke. She didn't react visibly when I played the clip of my mother's voice saying, "Don't let her keep that emergency spray nearby." When the audio ended, she folded her hands. "This is not a family misunderstanding," she said quietly. "This is potential intentional reckless endangerment." The word intentional hung between us. "They reduced my dosage gradually," I said. "It wasn't random." She nodded. "Premeditation matters. The pattern of decline strengthens that argument." I handed her the spreadsheet I had built that morning. She studied the columns, the dates, the dosage calculations. "You've documented this well?" she said. "Better than most clients." "I work in predictive modeling," I replied, "and they underestimated that." She asked for details about my epilepsy, how stable I had been before returning home, what missing doses could cause, whether long-term oxygen deprivation or uncontrolled seizures could result in permanent damage. "Yes," I said. "Or worse." She leaned back slightly. "If we move forward, we'll pursue both criminal and civil avenues," she said. "Reckless endangerment, obstruction of medical treatment, conspiracy if we can tie financial motive directly." I thought about the trust fund clause, about Chloe becoming temporary co-manager if I appeared unstable. "I have motive," I said. "There were transfers." "Show me." I opened my banking app and slid the phone across the table. She examined the entries. "2 completed transfers," she said. "And 1 pending. Authorized under your mother's credentials?" "Yes." "Was your father informed?" "I don't believe so." She tapped her pen once against the table. "If they were positioning you as medically unstable before a trust revision, that's not just sibling rivalry, that's asset control." The word control felt precise. She looked up at me again. "Has your sister ever confided in anyone?" Someone who might confirm intent? I hesitated. There was one person. Nora Delgado. 3 years earlier, Chloe had mentioned over dinner that Nora's small business was collapsing. Bankruptcy. Eviction. I'd contacted Nora quietly and loaned her money without telling anyone. She'd paid me back slowly over 2 years. Always grateful. Always discreet. If Chloe ever bragged, it would have been to her. I texted Nora from Sarah's office. "Can we meet? It's about Chloe. It's serious." She responded within minutes. Yes. We met the next afternoon at a cafe near her office in New Haven. Nora looked thinner than I remembered. Nervous. I didn't ease into it. I showed her a still image from the garage footage. Chloe kneeling near my coffee table at 1:27 a.m. Nora's face lost color. "She actually did it," she whispered. "Did what?" I asked, though I already knew. She swallowed. "She texted me. I thought she was exaggerating." "Show me." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her message history and scrolled. There it was. "Tonight I removed 2 pills. Sent at 12:41 a.m. Another message, 2 days later. She's starting to doubt herself. Then, "Mom says if she spirals before Dad signs, we're safe." My chest tightened, but I kept my voice even. "There's more?" Nora hesitated, then scrolled further. A message from my mother's number forwarded by Chloe. "Delete your search history about dosage timing." The cafe noise faded into a dull hum around us. "You didn't think it was serious?" I asked. "I thought it was just mean," Nora said softly. "Not criminal." I took screenshots with her permission and forwarded them to Sarah immediately. That evening, Sarah filed a motion to preserve digital evidence before deletion. Within 48 hours, a formal request was issued to secure Chloe's devices and browsing history. When preliminary data came back, it confirmed what we already suspected: search queries. How long until seizure without medication? Can missing doses cause cognitive decline? Signs of epilepsy instability. The timestamps matched the week I moved home. It was methodical, planned. I should have felt fury. Instead, I felt something colder. Precision. Sarah called me again 2 days later. "There's another layer," she said. "We obtained preliminary documentation from the trust's financial administrator." I closed my laptop at work and listened. "Your mother authorized transfers categorized as business support," she continued. "But the language is vague, and your father's signature is absent on at least one." I stared at the skyline outside my office window. "Is that fraud?" I asked. "It could be," she said, "especially if funds were diverted under misrepresentation." She paused. "If your seizure had been documented as evidence of cognitive instability, it would have strengthened a case to limit your authority over trust matters." The room felt smaller. "They were aligning the timeline," I said. "Yes." "And if I had another seizure, worse than the first?" "Then you would appear medically compromised during a critical legal update." Silence stretched between us. "I want to move forward," I said finally. "We will," she replied. "But understand something." "What?" "When they realize you're not collapsing the way they expected, they may escalate." I ended the call and looked down at my phone. A notification from my medication app flashed on the screen. "Reminder, refill in 3 days." I frowned. I hadn't set that alert for this week. I opened the app settings. The refill reminder had been modified 2 days ago, from my own device. At a time I had been in a meeting at work, someone hadn't just been adjusting my pill count. They had accessed my system. They were trying to control the narrative and the timing. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't about jealousy. It was about removing me from the equation entirely, and they had underestimated The one thing I never underestimated in my own life. Patterns. Sarah called me at 7 in the morning. "The trust update meeting is in 11 days, she said, without preamble. "If your father signs before we intervene, Chloe gains provisional authority under the incapacity clause." I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the thin carpet beneath my feet. So they needed one documented seizure before then. "Yes," Sarah replied. "One visible episode tied to instability could shift perception, especially if your mother frames it correctly." I thought about the way Chloe had stood over me, calm, observing. "She said they might escalate," I said. "They might," Sarah answered, "if they sense you're building a case." I checked out of the motel that afternoon and drove back to the house. I told myself I needed more footage, more documentation, more proof before the trust meeting. Chloe was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables with exaggerated care. "How are you feeling?" she asked sweetly. "Any more episodes?" "I'm fine," I said. My mother appeared from the hallway, her tone measured. "We've been worried. Maybe we should organize your medication for you, just until things stabilize." "I've got it handled." Chloe smiled. "You don't have to prove anything, Abby." "Prove." I went straight to the living room and replaced my pill bottle on the table. Only this time, I slid it into a small lockbox I had picked up on the way home. Biometric access. My fingerprint only. I also installed a second micro camera inside the base of the bookshelf, angled toward the couch and table. That night, I pretended to fall asleep without taking my pill. At 10, my alarm chimed softly. I silenced it without opening the lockbox. At 11, the house quieted. At 12:47 a.m., the hallway light flicked on. I kept my breathing slow and even. Footsteps approached. Chloe's shadow stretched across the living room wall. She crouched beside the coffee table. I could feel her presence inches from me. Her hand hovered over the lockbox. She tugged once, twice. The metal didn't budge. She leaned closer. I felt the faint movement of air as she reached toward my neck. Her fingers pressed lightly against my pulse point. Checking. "Not yet," she whispered. Then she stood and walked away. I waited until I heard her bedroom door close before I opened my eyes. The next morning, my mother cornered my father in the kitchen, while I lingered just out of sight. "I think she forgot her medication again," she said softly. "She was restless last night." Chloe added, "Maybe she shouldn't be making financial decisions until she's stable." My father's voice sounded strained. "We're not doctors." "But we can see what's happening," my mother insisted. I stepped into the doorway. "What exactly is happening?" Chloe's expression shifted instantly. "We're just concerned." "My lab results were below therapeutic range," I said. "That's not stress, that's interference." "You're misinterpreting data," she replied. "You've always been obsessive." There it was again. Obsessive, dramatic, unstable. I stopped arguing. Instead, I excused myself and drove to Sarah's office. We compiled everything: the garage footage, Leonard's audio recordings, my blood work, my spreadsheets, the new clip from the hidden camera showing Chloe testing the lockbox and checking my pulse. Sarah listened, then folded her hands. "This crosses into intentional reckless endangerment," she said, "and obstruction of medical treatment." "Can we file?" I asked. "Yes." We met with a detective that afternoon. He watched the footage without blinking. "She reduced your dosage gradually," he said, "and removed your emergency medication. That's premeditated." Hearing the word out loud made something settle inside me. Premeditated. Leonard agreed to provide a sworn affidavit. Nora signed consent for her text messages to be entered as evidence. The detective requested immediate preservation of digital devices at the house to prevent deletion. That evening, I packed a duffel bag. My mother watched from the hallway. "You're being dramatic," she said quietly. "You're tearing this family apart." "I didn't hide my own medication," I replied. Chloe leaned against the stair railing. "Running away now? I'm protecting myself." She laughed. "From what?" I didn't answer. When I reached the upstairs bathroom to grab my toiletries, I opened the cabinet beneath the sink. Behind a stack of cleaning supplies, I saw something small and white. My emergency nasal spray. Hidden. Not misplaced. Not forgotten. Deliberately removed from the living room and tucked out of reach. I held it in my hand for a long moment, staring at it. They hadn't just reduced my daily dose. They had eliminated my safety net. I placed the spray in my bag and walked back downstairs. "I'm staying somewhere else for a while," I said. My father looked up sharply. "Why?" "For my health." He glanced between my mother and Chloe, uncertainty flickering across his face. Chloe's jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" I left without waiting for an answer. The motel room felt smaller this time, but safer. At 9 p.m., my phone buzzed. Detective Harris. "We served a digital preservation notice at your parents' residence tonight," he said. "Your sister was not pleased." I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headboard. "Were you able to secure the devices?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "And, Ms. Turner, you were right to come forward." When the call ended, I stared at the ceiling. The night she stepped over me, she believed she controlled the outcome. She believed one seizure would rewrite the narrative. Now her laptop was in evidence. Her phone was in evidence. The hidden spray was in my bag. And for the first time since I collapsed on that floor, the power had shifted. They weren't watching me anymore. They were being watched. The courthouse steps were colder than I expected. I stood there for a moment, staring at the heavy glass doors of the Hartford County building, my hands tucked into the pockets of my coat. 3 months earlier, I had been lying on a hardwood floor while my sister stepped over me. Now I was walking into a courtroom. Sarah stood beside me, reviewing the final documents on her tablet. "Remember," she said quietly, "you don't need to react. Let the evidence do that." I nodded. Chloe arrived 10 minutes later with our mother. She wore a pale blue blazer and her hair in a sleek low bun, the same style she used when she wanted to look composed on camera. She caught my eye and gave me a small, almost amused smile, like this was still a misunderstanding that would collapse any second. My father followed a few steps behind them. He looked older than he had in the spring. Thinner. He avoided looking at me. Inside the courtroom, the air felt tight. Nora was already seated behind Sarah's table. Chloe hadn't noticed her yet. When she finally did, I saw it. A flicker. The judge entered. The room rose. The prosecutor began by stating the charges clearly: intentional reckless endangerment, obstruction of medical treatment, and conspiracy tied to financial manipulation within a family trust structure. Chloe's attorney attempted to soften it immediately. "This is a deeply personal family conflict," he said. "Stress and miscommunication have escalated assumptions." Assumptions? Sarah didn't argue emotionally. She began with medical records. My neurologist took the stand first. He explained my condition clinically. Post-traumatic epilepsy. Strict medication adherence required to maintain therapeutic levels. The risk of status epilepticus. The possibility of permanent brain damage. The possibility of death. The word death landed harder than anything else. Chloe shifted in her seat. The prosecutor then displayed my blood work results on the monitor. Dates, declining levels, consistent underdosing. "Could stress alone produce this pattern?" he asked. No, my neurologist replied evenly. This pattern reflects missed or reduced dosage. Then came the digital records. Nora was sworn in. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she described the text messages. The prosecutor projected them on the courtroom screen. Tonight, I removed 2 pills. A murmur rippled through the room. She's starting to doubt herself. Chloe's jaw tightened. If she collapses before Dad signs, we're safe. My father's head snapped toward Chloe. Then the final message appeared. From my mother. Delete your search history about dosage timing. Silence. Absolute silence. Chloe's attorney rose quickly. Context is missing. Sit down, the judge said calmly. The record will reflect the full thread. The prosecutor requested permission to play the audio recording from Leonard's porch camera. It played through the speakers, grainy but unmistakable. Chloe's voice, controlled. Reduce it slowly. My mother's voice. Just make sure it happens before your father signs. I didn't look at Chloe. I watched my father. His face had gone completely gray. The prosecutor then introduced financial documentation. Transfers from the shared investment account tied to the trust. 2 completed. 1 attempted. Routed to Turner Media Solutions. Were these authorized by you? The prosecutor asked my father when he was called briefly to clarify the signatures. No, he said hoarsely. I did not approve those. The courtroom shifted again. Now this was no longer just about medication. It was about motive. The prosecutor tied the timeline together carefully. Declining medication levels, digital searches about seizure timing, trust revision scheduled, transfers to Chloe's business, narrative building around my alleged instability. When we examine these facts collectively, he said, we see not negligence, but coordination. Chloe stood suddenly. This is insane, she said, her voice cracking. She's always been dramatic. The judge's expression did not change. Sit down, he repeated. Chloe's hands were shaking now, not subtly. Her fingers trembled against the edge of the defense table. For the first time since that night on the floor, she looked uncertain. The prosecutor continued. Interfering with life-sustaining medication, particularly with knowledge of the risk, constitutes intentional endangerment. The financial transfers demonstrate a clear incentive tied to the defendant's actions. Chloe's attorney requested a recess. When they returned 20 minutes later, the tone had shifted. Her attorney stood. My client is prepared to accept a plea agreement. The charges were read. Intentional, serious endangerment. Obstruction of medical treatment. The sentence followed. 30 months probation. 250 hours of community service. Full restitution for medical costs and temporary relocation expenses. A 7-year restraining order prohibiting contact with me. The judge's voice was steady as he concluded. This court finds that the defendant engaged in a pattern of conduct designed to manipulate medical vulnerability for financial advantage. Financial advantage? The prosecutor then added one more statement. The investigation into potential financial fraud involving additional parties remains ongoing. My mother's knuckles had turned white around her purse strap. Before proceedings closed, Chloe turned toward me. Tears streaked down her face now. I just wanted to matter, she said, her voice breaking. You always got everything. I stood slowly. You were always seen, I said quietly. You just wanted me erased. The judge struck the gavel. It was over. Outside the courthouse, the air felt sharp and clean. Reporters had gathered, but I ignored the questions. I ignored the cameras. Sarah touched my arm gently. You did exactly what you needed to do. I looked back at the courthouse doors once. Chloe wasn't smiling anymore. The night she stepped over me, she thought I was powerless. In that courtroom, she learned I had been watching the whole time, and I had been keeping records. 1 week after the sentencing, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating, just quiet. I was staying in a short-term rental in Boston while I finalized paperwork and searched for something more permanent. The restraining order had been processed. 7 years of no contact. Chloe was required to check in with a probation officer twice a month. 250 hours of community service, restitution for medical expenses, and relocation costs. My mother had not called. My father had moved out of the house 2 days after the hearing. Sarah's number lit up my phone just after noon.
"The probate process on your grandmother's estate has closed," she said. "There's a separate provision naming you directly." I sat down slowly. "I thought everything went to my parents." "Not everything," she replied. "There's a property in Vermont solely in your name, and a personal letter addressed to you. Vermont, my grandmother's favorite place in the world." I drove north 2 days later. The highway gave way to narrower roads lined with pine trees and frozen lakes. The air grew sharper the farther I went, clean and cold against my face when I cracked the window. The house wasn't grand. It was small. White siding, dark green shutters, a narrow porch facing a stretch of water that reflected the sky like glass. I stood in front of the door and let myself feel something I hadn't allowed in weeks. Ownership. The deed carried only my name. No cosigners, no shared clauses, no language about incapacity or provisional authority. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The furniture was simple but intact. A plaid blanket folded neatly over the back of a couch. A wooden dining table with 2 chairs. On the kitchen table sat an envelope. My name written in my grandmother's careful, slightly slanted handwriting. I traced the letters with my thumb before opening it. "My dearest Abigail, I have watched your family dynamic for years, and I regret that I could not shield you more directly. You were never fragile. You were inconvenient to those who feared accountability." My throat tightened. She wrote about the favoritism she had observed, the way my mother bristled at my independence, the subtle resentment whenever I questioned financial decisions or asked for clarity. She admitted she had suspected irregularities in family accounts long before my seizure. "I worried they would one day mistake your strength for instability," she wrote. "So I chose to give you something no one else could touch. The Vermont house is yours, entirely. No shared authority, no contingency clauses. A place where your health, your decisions, and your life cannot be leveraged against you." I read the letter twice, then a third time. The lake outside the window shimmered under the pale winter sun. For the first time in months, I felt seen, not defended, not pitied. Seen. Later that afternoon, I explored the house more carefully. In a desk drawer in the small study, I found a folder labeled Correspondence. Inside were copies of letters exchanged between my grandmother and her attorney. One referenced a heated discussion years earlier regarding the structure of the family trust. Another mentioned my mother's insistence on protecting the weaker daughter. A handwritten note in the margin caught my eye. "Do not allow medical vulnerability to become financial vulnerability." My grandmother had underlined the phrase twice. There were also references to offshore accounts that she had questioned. She had requested documentation that was never fully provided. This pattern had not begun with my seizure. It had escalated. 2 days later, there was a knock on the door. I knew it was my father before I opened it. He looked older than he had in court, shoulders slightly stooped, eyes tired. "I didn't know if you'd answer," he said. "I wasn't sure either," I replied. He stepped inside but remained near the door. "I've initiated a forensic audit," he said. "There were accounts I didn't know about, transfers I didn't authorize." I nodded once. I never intended for you to be in danger," he continued. "I didn't see it clearly until it was undeniable." "You saw enough," I said quietly. He flinched. "I was wrong to stay silent," he admitted. "Silence isn't neutrality. I understand that now." We stood in the small living room, the lake visible through the window behind him. "I can't erase what happened," he said, "but I want to try to do better." I studied his face. "Love without protection isn't enough," I told him. He nodded slowly. "I know." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't demand reconciliation. He left after a few minutes, the door closing softly behind him. That evening, I sat at the desk in the study and transferred my remaining investments fully out of any account tied to the family trust. I updated my estate documents with Sarah's help. Medical power of attorney assigned to someone outside the family. Clear directives. No ambiguity. I walked through the cottage once more before bed. The kitchen, the small bedroom, the study with its wooden desk and the folder of letters. This wasn't just property. It was insulation. It was proof that someone had anticipated the possibility that my independence would threaten those who depended on control. My phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "The financial investigation into your mother has expanded," she wrote. "Preliminary findings suggest undisclosed offshore accounts. This may become more serious." I set the phone down. Justice would unfold in its own time, but it no longer defined my stability. I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs, but it felt clean. The lake stretched out in front of me, undisturbed. For years, I had thought resilience meant surviving within a hostile system. Now I understood something else. Resilience meant leaving it. The house in Vermont wasn't just an inheritance. It was evidence that someone had always believed I would outgrow the chaos. And now, standing there in the quiet, I finally had. The first night I slept in Vermont, I woke up before dawn out of habit. For a split second, my body braced for panic, for the hardwood floor, for the aura creeping in like static at the edge of my vision. But the room was still, quiet. My medication sat on the bedside table exactly where I had placed it. My alarm had gone off at 10 the night before, and I had taken the pill with a glass of water while looking out at the lake. No one hovered over me. No one checked my pulse. No one calculated how much oxygen I could lose before it became useful. I lay back against the pillow and let the silence settle into my bones. Freedom doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the absence of interference. Over the next few weeks, I built routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks along the frozen shoreline. Work calls from the small desk in the study, sunlight filtering through the window. Evenings cooking simple meals without the tension of being watched. My neurologist adjusted my dosage slightly after reviewing the full incident timeline. My blood levels stabilized within 2 weeks. No anomalies, no dips, no unexplained fluctuations. The data was clean again. The financial investigation moved forward quietly. Sarah updated me periodically. Preliminary findings confirmed undisclosed accounts linked to my mother, transfers routed through shell entities, language in trust documents that had been subtly altered over the years. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt informed. Chloe complied with probation requirements. She completed the first portion of her community service at a local nonprofit. The restraining order meant I didn't see her, didn't hear her, didn't receive late-night accusations about destroying the family. Once, I found myself thinking about the moment in court when her hands began to shake. Not because I enjoyed it, but because it marked the exact second control shifted. For years, I had been framed as the difficult one, the overly analytical one, the dramatic one. But data doesn't dramatize. It documents. My father called occasionally. Brief conversations. Updates about the audit.
about the separation paperwork. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't minimize what happened. He listened more than he spoke. That was new. One afternoon, I opened my grandmother's letter again and reread the line she had underlined in her legal notes. Do not allow medical vulnerability to become financial vulnerability. I understood now that this wasn't just about epilepsy. It was about how easily weakness, real or perceived, can be weaponized inside a family system built on favoritism and control. I had survived the seizure, but what mattered more was that I refused to survive the narrative they built around it. A month after moving into the Vermont house, I invited Leonard to visit. He stood on the porch, looking out at the lake, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "She would be proud of you," he said. "She saw it coming," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Some people mistake quiet observation for weakness." I smiled faintly. They won't make that mistake again. That night, I set my medication beside the bed, double-checked the lock on the front door, and turned off the lights. As I lay there in the dark, I thought about that sentence Chloe had thrown at me while I was still disoriented on the floor. "Stop faking!" The irony almost made me laugh now. There is nothing performative about a body seizing. There is nothing imaginary about oxygen deprivation. And there is nothing dramatic about protecting your own life. My victory wasn't watching her tremble in court. It wasn't hearing the prosecutor read those text messages aloud. It wasn't even the restraining order or the restitution. My victory was this. I no longer needed them to validate my reality. I no longer needed to prove that what I experienced was real. I trusted my data. I trusted my instincts. And I trusted the fact that self-preservation is not betrayal. Family can be love. But family can also be manipulation, gaslighting, and financial control disguised as concern. When those lines blur, the bravest thing you can do is document the truth and step outside the system entirely. As I drifted toward sleep, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not because someone else promised to protect me, but because I had done it myself. If you've ever been told you were too dramatic when you were simply telling the truth, if you've ever been made to doubt your own memory, your own body, your own instincts, I hope my story reminds you of something important. Trust yourself. When patterns don't make sense, look closer. When your reality is questioned, document it. And when your safety is compromised, you are not obligated to stay silent for the sake of family peace. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter more than you think, and this space is here for honest conversations about betrayal, strength, and reclaiming your life. If you're new here, consider subscribing and staying with our community. Every week, we share stories about justice, resilience, and the quiet power of people who refuse to disappear. Until next time, protect your truth. No one else will do it for you.